Beatles Cartoons analysis. The Beatles Cartoons, actually titled The Beatles, ran for 3 series and was originally aired on Saturday mornings on ABC in the US between the 25th of September 1965 to the 21st of October 1967. There are many Paul is Dead style clues throughout the cartoons, as well as stories concerning magic, the occult, sacrifice, transformation of mind and image, and the use of doubles. There are even a couple of curious cartoons about alien agendas and inner Earth portals, which was truly surprising. This video highlights the best of these stories and PID clues. Each animated episode comprised of a 5-minute cartoon, followed by 2 animated sing-along sections, and then another 5-minute cartoon. There were 39 episodes made from the 78 cartoons. It's interesting to note that the real Paul McCartney was still alive during the original airing of the first 54 cartoons out of the 78 produced. There are PID clues in the cartoons both before and after he died. Cartoon number 1, A Hard Day's Night, first aired 25th of September 1965. Starting as the series meant to carry on, the first episode is based in a Transylvanian graveyard. The grave on the right is engraved with Mac, a sly reference to Paul. The cartoon also features Frankenstein's monster figure as a caretaker of a neighbouring castle. Whilst rehearsing in the castle, the Beatles find themselves surrounded by ghosts and ghouls. Ringo's drum kit turns into a skull and bones, which might equally be a reference to the fatal head injury that the real Paul McCartney suffered, as well as the Yale-based secret society Skull and Bones. As the Beatles finish singing the line, "You know, I feel all right," they drop to the floor as though dead. Their instruments, as though possessed, carry on playing without them. Cartoon number 4, If I Fell, first aired 2nd of October 1965. John Lennon is kidnapped by a mad scientist called Dr. Flora Ride, a pun on fluoride. She wants a Beatles brain to animate her monster. That's Beatles with 2 E's, like the scarab beetle. Her assistant instead gets John, because he claims that John is the brains of the Beatles band. At this point, the pun on the doctor's name seems to point to the connection between the consumption of fluoride and its effects on the brain, i.e. that it calcifies the pineal gland. John gets strapped to a table in order to have his mind transferred to the monster. The monster jumps up and starts to sing a love song and dance around. John, now somehow free from the table, tells the disappointed Dr. Flora Ride that, if she wanted her monster to have a brilliant mind, she should have used the brain of a scientist instead, rather than a pop star. This transference of his mind has connotations of the transmigration of Paul's soul that the Cabal planned at this point. Cartoon 6, Devil in Her Heart, first aired 9th of October 1965. The Beatles are back to Transylvania at a picnic grounds in a graveyard, like you do. George and Ringo have picnic caskets rather than a picnic basket, packed with fresh blood sausages. A stroll alongside the spooky woods sees Ringo talking to a headless horseman, possibly a reference to the soon-to-be headless Paul. He is then kidnapped by a wicked witch, who uses a love potion on him to convince Ringo to fall in love with her. In contrast to the plotline of the film Help, Ringo has a protective ring, causing the witch to fall into her own love potion, transforming her into a beautiful girl. This cartoon aired on John Lennon's birthday, and the story about a witch with a love potion frankly reminds me of Yoko. Cartoon number 9, Babies in Black, First aired 23rd of October 1965. Guess what? It's cartoon number 9, and the Beatles are yet again in Transylvania, in another empty, creepy castle. Paul wanders over to a sarcophagus in the position of Osiris risen. The excited Paul says that he's always wanted to know what it was like to be a mummy, whilst opening the sarcophagus, climbing inside, and also assuming the Osiris risen position. This is a stunning piece of predictive programming, considering that this is exactly what the Cabal had planned for him just 1 year later. The sliding door behind him opens up and he slides down a chute into the laboratory of another mad scientist called Professor Psycho. The professor is trying to animate a vampire monster who is half woman and half bat. He wants Paul's blood in order to bring her to life. Paul hides from the scientist by taking up his place in a lineup of other monsters made by the professor. The Batwoman comes to life, ties up Paul, and her scientist creator then forces him to marry her. The rest of the Beatles find Paul and rescue him. At this point, we find out that the vampire and the professor are actually fakes, trying to pull off a stunt to convince the Beatles to include the woman as a singer in their band. Paul is so relieved to not be in danger that he kisses her. The parallels between using Paul's blood to animate another singer and his death triggering the career of Billy should be obvious. Cartoon number 10, Misery. First aired 23rd of October 1965. This cartoon is based in a wax museum in London. In the story, Dracula is terrorizing London, and as the Beatles wander through the Chamber of Horrors, we see that Dracula is hiding among the exhibitions. John and Paul go off to find the Beatles exhibit. They dislike their own wax figures so much that they stand in for them as a joke. Two women walking through the waxworks comment that John and Paul don't look very lifelike, unlike the actual wax figures of George and Ringo. This has got to be a sarcastic judgment on the Beatles fans, who likewise can't always distinguish the real Beatles from their doubles. Whilst the Beatles are singing Misery, the wax figure of Marie Antoinette becomes animated, dancing with her own head. The Beatles get stuck in a museum with the real Dracula trying to attack them. They use their own wax figures as candles to see in the dark, and then melt them down completely in order to trap Dracula in the liquid wax. Thus we can see more examples of headlessness and sacrifice, both references to the soon-to-be-dead Paul. Cartoon 11, You've Really Got a Hold on Me. First aired 30th of October 1965. The Beatles go on safari in Africa. They hire a vehicle that quickly breaks down, but Ringo points out that he also made sure to hire a Jack. The Jack turns out to be Black Magic Jack, who practices voodoo and transforms a worm into a snake, which is used as a caterpillar track. This transformation through black magic could be another reference to the transformation of Billy into Paul via an occult ritual. The timing of the original airing of this cartoon is also interesting. This cartoon was shown on Halloween weekend of 1965. 1 year later, on Halloween 1966, Memoirs tells us that Billy held a séance that allowed him to communicate with the recently deceased Paul for the first time. Cartoon 12, Chains. First aired 30th of October 1965. The Beatles watch a film called Mutiny on the Bounty, and Ringo falls into a dream. Ringo dreams of being a ship's captain. His crew are the other Beatles, who don't merely mutiny his command, they also tie him up in the brig and sink the ship before deserting it, leaving Ringo to drown. We are told in the memoirs of Billy Shears that Paul regularly dreamt of his own death long before it happened. Since Ringo is often used as a substitute for Paul in the Cabal's hidden messages, Perhaps this is the idea behind this cartoon story. Cartoon 28, No Reply. First aired 25th of December 1965. The Beatles are in Japan. They get infiltrated by Anyface, the world's greatest master of disguise. When a second Paul surfaces, the Beatles go to the Cave of Truth to work out which one is real. The oracle of the cave tells both Pauls to climb the palm tree and dive into a tiny pool of water, claiming that the real Paul is certain to survive. Anyface goes first, but cheats in order to save his life. A group of screaming Beatles fans sees them, and the real Beatles instinctively know to run for cover. Anyface, not used to dealing with fans, stays put and gets trampled over. Later on, they find one of his fake noses, in which the rings he has stolen are being kept. This cartoon was aired on Christmas Day 1965, just under 9 months before Paul was due to die. The blatant messaging about there being two Pauls seems to have been used on one of the few days of the year when most people watch TV, and thus the idea would have been seen by the biggest possible audience. The fake nose might also be a reference to Billy and his use of fake noses to play the part of Vivian Stanshall. The use of a palm tree is mirrored in memoirs and on the front cover of Sgt. Pepper, where the word palm is a wordplay for Paul M. Cartoon 30, Mr. Moonlight. First aired 1st of January 1966. The Beatles find themselves adrift in a boat off the coast of the island of Mooney. They arrive on the island just in time for a total lunar eclipse. The local tribe decide to sacrifice the Beatles by throwing them into the volcano in order to appease their gods and bring back the moon. John tells them that they can make the moon come back again by performing Mr. Moonlight. As the eclipse finishes, the tribe then consider the Beatles to be gods and celebrate them rather than killing them. This is actually quite an occulted story for another captive audience, this time on New Year's Day. In this story, the Beatles are almost sacrificed at a lunar eclipse, which is the sort of thing the Cabal do, performing such ceremonies on days of astrological significance. Cartoon 33, Anna. First aired 15th of January 1966. Paul finds himself on a ghost ship off the coast of Japan. The name of the ship is Anna, the same name as the ghost roaming its decks. Paul is very happy on the ship and doesn't really want to leave Anna. Interestingly, Anna in Japanese means a hole, a vacancy, or a missing person from a group. Perhaps the implication here is that Anna is luring Paul to his death in the cartoon, just as Donna triggers Paul's death in the car crash cover story of his real death. Cartoon 53, 8 days a week. First aired 10th of September 1966. This cartoon starts the second series on the day before Paul died. The titles for the first series featured the Beatles being chased by screaming fans, backed by the song Can't Buy Me Love. For the second series, the fans are back, but now there is a strong spy movie or Bond film vibe to the chase. They even have the Bond incidental music, which then segues into the song Help. Obviously, this song ties into the then recent film and album of the same name, but it also underlines the idea that the Beatles are trapped and can't escape. The cover story for Paul's murder involves him storming out of a studio after a fight and picking up a hitchhiker called Donna, who is very excited by the discovery that Paul is her driver. She is such a big fan of his that she distracts him into crashing the car, which kills them both. Bear this in mind as I tell you the story of this cartoon that first aired the day before he died. The Beatles go to a movie studio where they discover Lips Lovelace, the movie star lover. He claims he just can't kiss anymore, and Paul decides to take up his old job. In Paul's first movie, he has to kiss an actress who is crazy for Paul, and her jealous lover wants to kill him. Paul runs out of the studio and into a car. The actress runs after him and jumps into the car with Paul. Her gangster lover chases after them in another car. Paul's car starts to fall apart. It even loses the steering wheel so that he cannot steer. During the chase, the gangster's car crashes into a lamppost. Meanwhile, Paul, still trying to get away from the actress, drives off an unfinished bridge and crashes the car. They land in water and they don't die, but the bedraggled Paul quits his new job and hands it back to Lips Lovelace. So just to recap, on the day before Paul died in a car crash, the cartoon version of Paul also has a car crash. Of all the PID clothes I've seen, I think this is the one that is most blatant, right down to the timing of its airing. But this episode is not over. The other half of the episode involves cartoon number 54, I'm Looking Through You, which really seals the deal. Cartoon 54, I'm Looking Through You. First aired 10th of September 1966. The sacrifice of Paul McCartney is not merely about his death. It was also about the idea that he was the reincarnated Egyptian god Osiris. According to the mythology, after the death of Osiris, his soul was transmigrated into his son Horus's body, who is the new savior and king in the pantheon. According to the Cabal, Paul was Osiris and Billy, his replacement, is Horus. The mythology had to be reenacted to bring in Aleister Crowley's Aeon of Horus. Again, bear this in mind while I tell you what the next cartoon is about. In this cartoon, the Beatles are in Egypt. They stumble over a pyramid with the ghost of a long-dead pharaoh god wandering its halls. After thousands of years of waiting for a new body to reincarnate into, he's running out of patience. I must have a new body so that I can walk among the people again, he declares. Ringo, ever the decoy in these things, is the first to go into the pyramid, following a strip of tape on the ground. The pharaoh ghost is delighted to see Ringo and jumps into his body, kicking Ringo's soul out as he possesses the body. After running around in the clumsy Ringo's body, the pharaoh decides that it just won't do, and hands it back to Ringo, who is very relieved to have his body back again. The pharaoh then looks up and sees Paul. Now that's a beautiful body, claims the pharaoh as he speeds towards Paul. You don't want my body, I'm ugly, splutters the frightened Paul as he tries to run away. So, again, to recap, the Cabal think Paul was a disguised Egyptian god who'd waited thousands of years to reincarnate, and in the cartoon, Paul encounters a ghost at an Egyptian pyramid looking for a body to reincarnate into, and who ultimately chooses Paul's body. I found this cartoon double bill stunningly on the nose in terms of its disclosure. It's so close to the actual truth claimed in memoirs that those in the know at the time must have had a sick laugh at everyone else's expense, especially Paul's. Cartoon 55, Help, first aired 17th of September 1966. The Beatles are in Paris and follow a pretty girl into a fashion show. The thief, Jacques Le Zipper, steals the plans for the entire spring collection. Paul heroically chases him up the Eiffel Tower. The thief then uses a welding torch to destroy the section of tower that Paul is standing on, so that Paul falls off it. This made me think of the Tower card in a tarot deck, which is about chaos and destruction. Crowley's version is no different. In fact, it contains more fire and brimstone and even an all-seeing eye. Managing to cling on to a section of the tower, Paul climbs back up, only to have a door slammed in his face by the thief. He then falls off the tower again. Paul doesn't die. We see him clinging to a rope instead, in what seems to be an allusion to the Hanged Man card, the card of Paul's sacrifice as Osiris, according to Crowley followers. The thief burns the rope, making Paul fall off the tower for a third time. Paul climbs back up yet again, and instead slams a door in the thief's face. Grabbing the fashion show plans, Paul runs off with them, but slides off the tower again. He falls to the ground this time, along with the thief. The thief seems to die, but Paul is caught with a safety net, held out by the other Beatles and the grateful fashion show organisers. This is the first cartoon aired after Paul was killed. In this cartoon, Paul almost dies 4 times in the space of 5 minutes. The other Beatles hardly even feature in their own cartoon. The whole point of this episode seems to be to show the sacrifice of Paul, whilst the song Help plays in the background. It's also interesting that it's based in Paris, and in Memoirs, Billy goes to Paris after Paul's death, trying to fix Paul's broken Aston Martin. He also meets John for the first time. But wait, we're not finished. The sing-along section in between this cartoon and the next one features the song Day Tripper. Set in a metro train station, this sing-along shows Ringo, the decoy for Paul, jokingly committing suicide. First he shoots himself to the words, "for taking the easy way out." On the repeat of these words, we see him then hang himself. What a cheerful thing for small children to watch at 10:30 on a Saturday morning. Also bear in mind that the lyrics to Day Tripper also include the line, "Day Tripper, Sunday driver, yeah," which is of course when Paul died, on a Sunday morning, supposedly after having a car crash. Cartoon 56, We Can Work It Out, first aired 17th of September 1966. The Beatles are in Hollywood. The superstitious George is overheard by a crook masquerading as a lucky wizard. In order to give the illusion of his benevolence, he tries to kill George by dropping a stone block on him, but then rescuing him just in time, thus gaining his trust. The wizard shrinks the Beatles, then captures them in a glass magic ball. Their shrinking by magic has Alice in Wonderland vibes, but then the wizard joins them in the glass magic ball, turning Paul's bass guitar into a crocodile. This seems a bit random at first, until we recall that, in Egyptian mythology, the crocodile god Sobek, along with Isis, was the healer of the deceased Osiris, following his violent death by his brother Set. Sobek is associated with creativity. That's why a crocodile features on the full tarot card in the Thoth deck. Cartoon 57, I'm Down, first aired 24th of September 1966. The Beatles are back in France, at a vineyard. This brings us back to the Fool card, which has the Fool holding grapes, symbolizing the cult of Dionysus, the god of wine and madness. In the cartoon, a vat of wine falls down and we see one of the injured winemakers in a pool of wine, which at first glance looks like blood. The Beatles offer to help the winemakers produce a month's worth of wine in just 2 hours to meet the factory's 5 o'clock deadline. 5 o'clock being the time that Paul was meant to have died. The song the Beatles used to motivate the workers is I'm Down, which seems like an odd choice. The lyrics include the lines, I'm down, down in the ground, how can you laugh when you know I'm down? These lyrics are clearly a reference to the now buried Paul, as this cartoon was aired a fortnight after his death. Into the sing-along section we hear Paperback Writer. This song seems to have been written by Billy. In the Winged Beetle video, we see references to the International Times, the 1960s underground newspaper. Several clippings involve a writer called Ian Icamo, which is Paul McCartney said backwards. The video also claims that Billy wrote Beatles songs using this pseudonym, including Paperback Writer. In the sing-along version of Paperback Writer, we see lots of books with titles taken from Beatles songs. The last two books, however, are actually the album title Revolver, the cover of which has the audience looking down the barrel of a gun, followed by a photo of Paul standing in front of a window frame, which makes him look like he's on a cross. This ties in with the idea of Paul's death and sacrifice at the center of the incoming New World Order's religion of Paulism. A whole chapter is devoted to this topic in Memoirs. Cartoon 60. Tell Me What You See. First aired 1st of October 1966. The Beatles go to a Hollywood movie studio called Monster Pictures and hang out in the makeup department. They meet a master makeup artist, referred to as the man with 1,000 faces. These are surely references to Billy, the man with 1,000 voices, being the man to replace Paul through the use of latex masks, makeup and wigs, as well as facial surgery. Ringo, ever the Paul decoy, is shown a latex mask of his own face. The makeup artist leaves the room and tells the Beatles not to touch anything. They, of course, disobey, and to teach them a lesson, the makeup artist turns on his makeup machine, which transforms a person into another being. Ringo enters the machine and immediately becomes Frankenstein's monster. The other Beatles push each other into the machine, and all of them become Ringo. During many more transformations, we see 3 of the Beatles turn into actual Beatles, who carry John into the machine. This could be an allusion to scarab beetles in Egyptian mythology. Soon after, we see 2 Pauls fighting each other, one of whom seems furious at the existence of the other. Eventually, the machine explodes and all the Beatles run off. Cartoon 64. Day Tripper. First aired 15th of October 1966. The Beatles go to the cinema and watch a film called The Way Out Creatures from Glom. After teasing each other as to how they would react to an actual alien visitation, a flying saucer lands next to them. At first they run, but then they realize that the spaceship was flown by an Amazonian beauty, who gives them tickets to an outer space ride. The female captain dumps them on a planet that is 23 billion miles away from Earth. "Yes, I've done it," she cries. "I've saved the universe from the Beatles." I found this very curious. I wondered whether this was connected to the benevolent alien agenda, in direct opposition to the negative alien agenda, or whether it was a reference to Project Bluebeam, the idea of a fake alien attack used to gain control over the masses. In any case, whilst on the distant planet, the Beatles start to play Day Tripper. The creatures on that planet become instant fans of the Beatles. They shapeshift into humanoids, and then help the Beatles to get back to Earth by letting them use their transporter machine. As they beam home, they also shapeshift to resemble the creatures that help them to get home. As they step out of the machine, they then shapeshift back into their old Beatle selves. Being on a planet that is 23 billion miles away was also interesting. This cartoon was animated by the same people who made the Yellow Submarine film. The number 23 also features in that film as a reference to the 2 Pauls and the 3 other Beatles. Cartoon 66. Paperback Writer. First aired 22nd of October 1966. The Beatles are asked to each write a paperback book about how they met. Each of them concoct wild stories instead of the truth. Ringo imagines himself as a stage actor who signs his autograph for his grovelling fans, who are Paul, John, and George. They sell his autograph to gain the funds to buy themselves instruments, and Ringo then joins their band. As Paul takes a bow, we segue into his version of events, in which he gets knighted by the Queen. From our perspective, this seems like predictive programming now. Paul is not a musician, but actually a brilliant scientist who develops a cure for malaria. He has "Beetle Killer" written on a poster on his wall. Whilst working on a treatment for yellow fever, Paul requests 3 prisoners with life sentences to test his drugs on. The prisoners are the other 3 Beatles. Paul tells them that if they survive the drug, they'll be free to sing together. As Paul injects George, we see a large number 9 on the screen. All of them fall down dead. Next we see George's story. It starts with him playing guitar in front of a poster that seems to say, "Don't be fooled," with sun symbolism next to it. To the right is another sign saying, "Year of Dazzling Advance." George's story involves him in a spy story. He is an MI6 agent, code number 008. He catches the other 3 Beatles, who are crooks. They plead for their lives and then form a band. This part of the story reflects the input of British military intelligence, which both helped to set up the Beatles, but also aided the death of Paul and its cover-up. Specifically, it points to Ian Fleming, the author of the Bond novels, who knew the MI5 spy master Maxwell Knight and Aleister Crowley. Lastly, we have John's story. This has the war narrative vibes of his actual film, How I Won the War, which was produced around the same time as this cartoon first aired. In the cartoon, John is a fighter pilot. He downs a Nazi airship, manned by the other 3 Beatles, dressed as Nazi officers. He captures them and then marches them off the airship. I wonder how the other 3 Beatles felt about being portrayed as Nazis. We are told in memoirs that EMI had Nazi connections and regularly used musicians from West Germany because of those connections. I wonder if this cartoon was alluding to that history. By now, the Beatles' would-be publisher throws the Beatles out of his office, enraged by their deceptions. Let's be honest, as crazy as those stories are, they are, in many ways, no more crazy than the actual official Beatles narrative. In a heap on the ground, the Beatles ask each other how they really met. Ringo says that they just bumped into each other in Liverpool, thus reinforcing the official narrative. The paperback writer's story, of course, reminds us of the true story of the Beatles, written by Billy Shepherd of the Beatles book. I don't know who this is. Is it the one and only Billy Shears, or someone else? Cartoon 67. The 3rd series opening titles. First aired 16th of September 1967. The first episode of the 3rd series first aired on the 16th of September 1967. Almost a whole year after the last episode, and a year after Paul's death. We now see Billy featured in the new opening titles, alongside images of Paul. The Beatles are also depicted with playing card symbols. George is diamonds, John is clubs, Paul is hearts, and Ringo is spades. These are totally different from the groupings mentioned in memoirs, which sees Paul as spades, or swords in tarot, John as diamonds, or pentacles in tarot, George as clubs, or wands in tarot, and Ringo as hearts, cups in tarot. The other images of Paul show him in disguises, as though they were attempting to blend in the old look of the real Paul into the image of Billy as the new Paul. Cartoon 68, Strawberry Fields, first aired 16th of September 1967. In this cartoon, the Beatles visit an orphanage called Strawberry Fields, named after the real orphanage that inspired the song, Strawberry Fields Forever. Everything there is run down, broken and grey. The children are miserable until the Beatles start to perform Strawberry Fields Forever. Then the grey orphanage is magically transformed into bright psychedelic colours. Even the backdrops to the Beatles are vivid fields of strawberries with trippy-looking skies. We see John wearing his granny-style glasses for the first time. A boy becomes a clown. A broken bicycle is transformed into a unicycle. A broken door becomes a helter-skelter at a fun fair, just like the ones that John Lennon used to attend at Strawberry Fields in Liverpool when he was a child. The fun fair theme continues with the transformation of a seesaw and a go-kart. We even see the Beatles as flowers, as a nod to the flower power of the Summer of Love. In juxtaposition to this, we see a very quick glance of John in his role as Sergeant Gripweed from How I Won the War. By the end of the song, the Beatles are flying over strawberry fields, no doubt a reference to their tripping on LSD. Even the adults below are transformed by the Beatles' music. We see them bathed in purple light, possibly an allusion to the purple colour of the crown chakra, with its connotations of illumination. The Beatles are delighted with the psychedelic colours and messages they have conveyed to the orphanage. The closing shot sees the Beatles' car floating with balloons above the funfair. John tells us that it's all in the mind, you know, a tagline that we will see again on the Yellow Submarine animation. Cartoon 70, Got to Get You Into My Life, first aired 23rd of September 1967. The Beatles are in India, 6 months before they were actually in India. They find a Swami laying on a bed of nails, who shows them a rope trick. He runs up the rope and disappears, only to reappear behind them. The Beatles say they want to have a deep and spiritual experience and to get out of their bodies. The Swami gives them a mantra to repeat and tells them to lay down until their spirits leave their bodies. He warns them that their bodies will walk off without them and that they should wake him to prevent this from happening. At first, they are delighted to float around without their bodies, but soon they see their bodies mindlessly walking off. Alarmed by this, they try to wake the Swami, but can't, not even by playing Got to Get You Into My Life right in front of him. They follow their bodies, walking off planks into cement and bouncing up and down on bridges with crocodiles below. Repeatedly, the Beatles' bodies are in danger, walking through the jungle and even off cliffs. Somehow, by dumb luck, their bodies fall back onto their spirits and they are united, body and soul, once again. They wake up, believing their adventure was just a dream. There are obvious parallels between this story and their time in India with the Maharishi. The problem is that none of what happened in India had happened yet at the time that this cartoon was first aired. The out-of-body experience narrative reflects what Billy says in memoirs about the Beatles' time in India. Part of the reason for being there was to learn to communicate with the now bodiless Paul. Cartoon 72, Ticket to Ride, first aired 30th of September 1967. I don't want to say too much about this cartoon, except that each of the Beatles dreams about what they will do in the future, and then takes up a hobby. Paul dreams that he will become a modern artist, and we see him painting, using his right hand, as Billy does. Also note the one-eyed symbolism. Cartoon 74, Eleanor Rigby, first aired 7th of October 1967. This cartoon is about a lonely old woman called Eleanor Rigby. All of the neighbourhood kids make fun of her and run away from her because they think she is a witch. The Beatles encourage the children to get to know her instead. We see Eleanor wearing a face that she keeps in a jar by the door. The mask slips and smashes on the ground. As the children come to accept her, the world is now psychedelically bright, and the children throw a party for her and invite everyone so that no one will be lonely. everyone is, of course, delighted because the Beatles provide the music. There is a parallel to be drawn between this story and the acceptance of Billy into the role of Paul. He also wears a mask, and now, a year after Paul has died, he is considered to truly be Paul McCartney by the masses. Cartoon 75, Tomorrow Never Knows. First aired 16th of October 1967. The Beatles go for a walk led by Paul. They seem to go to Stonehenge, at which they find an inner earth portal. Ringo is the first to fall into the portal in the way that Alice falls down a rabbit hole. The other Beatles follow him. They end up at a Mayan temple and climb inside the head of a statue. The local tribe think that their gods are speaking to them from the statue. The Beatles play Tomorrow Never Knows, which makes the people dance in a trance-like state, and even makes the statues and buildings come alive. We see Paul standing next to a figure that looks like Quetzalcoatl, the Mayan god. I wrote about him in my Substack in reference to a footnote in Memoirs on page 128 that connects the death of Paul to the Mayan calendar. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to read it. We see depictions of the Beatles on the temple walls, as though the Mayans had predicted their existence. At the end of the cartoon, the chief tribesman wants to marry the Beatles off to his daughters because even they are Beatles fans. This story reminds me of something I have read several times, but especially in Ashiana Dean's Voyages books, in which he describes a series of 12 inner Earth portals that connect to stargates. One of these portals connects Stonehenge to Machu Picchu. She was among the first people to disclose this information in the 1990s. How did this cartoon hit upon the same idea 30 years before she did? Cartoon 78, I'm Only Sleeping. First aired 21st of October 1967. This is the very last Beatles cartoon ever made. In the story, John falls asleep whilst reading a book. So far, so Alice. In his dream, John becomes part of the story in the legend of Arthur. He meets Merlin, the wizard, who is played like Tommy Cooper, and gallant knights trying to slay dragons. The pages of a book are used as the backdrops to the cartoon. I spent a while trying to work out which book was used here. There are many books concerning the Arthurian legend, and I feared that I might not be able to find the exact pages of the exact book that had been used. But I did. The book is Thomas Malory's Le Mort d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur, first published in 1485. It was originally written in early Middle English, but modern spelling was used in the backdrop images. The text was first published as a set of 21 books. It is now sold as 2 volumes, which preserve the text but use modern spellings. The passages used in the cartoon are in the second volume on pages 347 and 352. The passage on 347 concerns King Hulaim killing King Labour by cleaving his head open with a sword. I can only assume that this is a reference to Maxwell Knight and his silver hammer, which Memoirs implies was Paul's murder weapon. The line, "but he were dead," is clearly seen in the background image. The term hammer gives the impression of a blunt instrument, but actually, as you can see from the picture on page 365 of the 2023 edition of Memoirs, it is more like a mixture of a spear and an axe. We have Richard Balducci to thank for the discovery of this murder weapon. The other passage used as a backdrop in the cartoon is page 352 of Volume 2 of The Death of Arthur. It concerns King Solomon taking up King David's sword from his temple. At which point, I can only say one thing. The Masons did it. They may as well have spray painted that on the backdrop instead. So, that's the end of my analysis. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave your comments below. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.